Today, we are working on a lecture in Lacan's seminar in which he will present his first optical scheme. This is like one of the most important elements in the first seminar. In seminar one, the optical scheme is the way in which he connects what he's talking about, the technical writing by Freud, with his theory of the imaginary and with the mirror stage. I was planning how to present today's lecture, and I decided to change the order because he talks about the optical scheme at the beginning of the lecture, and then at the end, he comes back to the case of Dick, this Melanie Klein's case. Because we were talking about Dick last week, I prefer to switch it. I swapped it, right? So I will first finish with Lacan's discussion of the Dick's case. He has still some very interesting things to say about the way Melanie Klein handles this case. And then we start talking about the optical scheme. I guess some of you were reading this class and it's very surprising, right? He's talking about psychoanalysis and Melanie Klein and Anna Freud and the theories of the ego and the technique. And then he brings up something that comes from a completely different field, the field of optics. So it's a branch of physics. What does that have to do with psychoanalysis? We'll get there, but first, let us finish talking about Dick. And there is a connection also. We will see there is a strong connection between Lacan's discussion of Dick's case and the optical schema. What you see in the slide is me paraphrasing Lacan because this is a reading group. Even though I talk a lot, the main goal of this group is that we are able to have the experience of reading Lacan. So all the time I will keep doing this, like choosing some paragraphs, sometimes simplifying them a little bit and reading them aloud and explaining them so that we have more tools to work with his text. He's saying here, talking about Melanie Klein, that Melanie Klein has a theory of the development of the ego. And he says, in the course of the development of instinctual relations with this privileged object, the mother, the child is led into instigating a series of relations of imaginary incorporations. He or she can bite, absorb the body of his mother. The style of this incorporation is one of distraction. So here, Lacan is summarizing Melanie Klein's theory, saying while the child is developing, we would say for the subject to be constituted, the subject needs to have this kind of basic sadism towards its first object, that is the mother and the body of the mother. So he needs to appropriate for himself or herself this object. And the way the child does this is in this very aggressive manner. This is oral sadism. So the child bites, chews, incorporates, destroys, and this is a process of introjecting things into the child's ego and also throwing away, differentiating, projecting aspects of these objects that the child needs to differentiate from. So in this maternal body, and this is again Lacan summarizing Melanie Klein, in this maternal body, the child expects to encounter a certain number of objects. So what Lacan is saying is that Melanie Klein usually talks about some typical objects that the child finds in the mother's body. These can be parts of the mother's body. It could also be the father's penis. It could be the baby, urine, feces, though objects which might be dangerous for him are included amongst them. Why are some objects dangerous? Because this dynamic is aggressive, is violent, is sadist. So in the same way as the child is destroying these objects while incorporating them, it's part of this same logic that these objects can retaliate against him, right? So they become persecutory objects. So the father's penis, the mother's breast, all these can become bad objects that are attacking the child in this first primal fantasy world. But if the child is able to manage to tolerate the anxiety involved in this process, these objects in some way will be symbolized, neutralized. There will be equivalencies to other objects, symbolic equivalencies. So rather than, for example, the father's penis, there will be a train toy. There will be these displacements from this basic object towards other objects. So these other objects will be set up as the equivalents of these first ones, will be linked up with them through the imaginary equation. The symbolic equation that we rediscover between these objects arises from an alternating mechanism of expulsion and introjection, of projection and absorption. That is to say, from an imaginary interplay. If you read this paragraph, you will see that he at the same time says it's an imaginary equation and a symbolic equation. Why? Because if you stick to Melanie Klein's text, this is all fantasy. So this is all happening on an imaginary play. The child fantasizes with this. They are images of objects. But on the other hand, Lacan is saying, if an equivalence between an object and another, for example, if the train stands for the father, then it's a substitution. So something of the symbolism, something of the mechanism typical of symbols and language is already operating. So that's why he's at the same time saying it's imaginary, it's happening on an imaginary plane, but at the same time, if you look at it, like some metaphors are being constituted, right? When, for example, this little room in Melanie Klein's office becomes the mother's womb, well, then it's a symbol. So this is how language operates. It's a metaphor, basically. One important aspect is if this experience is so fragmented, right? If the mother's body is fragmented, which means that the child's body is also fragmented because the child's body is constituted in this interplay in an interaction with the mother's body, then as long as you're operating with this logic, the conjunction of different parts, right? The unification, sets can never be accomplished. And so Lacan says, in this, he's very ironic and sarcastic and quite evil with these other psychoanalysts. Melanie Klein has neither a theory of the imaginary nor a theory of the ego. It is up to us to introduce these notions. So in Melanie Klein, this is just a given, that this is the fantasy world of the child, but there's not a meta-psychology that explains how the subject develops and how, for example, you articulate the subject, the ego, the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real registers. So Lacan is here to provide us with, or he's attempting at develop this theory that is, he says, it is missing in Melanie Klein. So let's talk a little bit about Dick. Lacan starts talking about some aspects of the process that Dick is doing with Melanie Klein. One is, how does he accomplish this unification of partial objects, fragmented objects? Another one is, why does this interest in containers develops? Melanie Klein's answer is, well, the mother's body is a container. Lacan says Dick is playing with the container and the contained, right? For example, when he goes into this little room, this space between the two doors in Melanie Klein's office, that's a container, and the child contains himself there. Sometimes he puts things, for example, inside a water basin. Lacan says that Dick has quite naturally entified, right? Gave them solid existence in several objects. The little train, for example, a certain number of tendencies of persons, even himself as a little train in comparison with his father, who is the big train. So objects are constituted, partial aspects, fragmented aspects are unified, and there is a play with the container and the contained. One thing that Lacan argues, because Melanie Klein gives the impression that this child is somehow outside language. And this is like saying that he is completely outside the symbolic order. And Lacan does not agree with this. He says Dick possesses something of language. Otherwise, Melanie Klein could not make herself understood by him, right? She, from the first session, she's using language to symbolize things. And Dick feels the impact of her words. He's not outside this world, this symbolic world of words and language. he has some of the elements of the symbolic apparatus at his disposal. I want to highlight the uniform character of reality for him. So see how Lacan is um, talking about these three registers while commenting on Melanie Klein: the symbolic, the real, and the imaginary. What happens with reality? In a way, he does not participate of human reality, because our reality is constituted by objects that have some affective charge for us. They're not indifferent, have value. We like some people, are in love with other people, hate other people, are attached to some objects, and we can differentiate our objects in our environments. This is part of how we position ourselves as subjects in a human world, which is mediated by symbols, by language. But Dick does not have access to that human reality, but in a way, he's seeing reality as it is. It's like a flat reality where everything has equal value. Nothing stands out. He shows no interest in any specific object. Everything, he says, is equally real for him, equally indifferent. For him, the real and the imaginary are equivalent. So reality has this flat aspect, everything, like he shows no interest in any object, which is to say that the real and the imaginary are not differentiated. Because when you start investing in some objects that are especially attractive or repulsive or interesting for you, then this is your fantasy life, articulating, giving shape to your reality and differentiating the imaginary from the real. The child's world, Melanie Klein tells us, is manufactured out of a container. This would be the body of the mother, and out of the contents of the body of this mother, right? So this is again the logic of the container and the contained. A little bit more about Dick's relationship with reality. Dick is eyeball to eyeball with this reality. He lives in reality, but what Lacan is saying, not in a human reality. It's a little bit like an animal reality in the sense of a pre-symbolized reality. In Melanie Klein's office, there is neither other nor ego for him, just a reality, pure and simple. So in this flat reality, there is no subjectivity. So Dick treats Melanie Klein exactly just as a piece of furniture, as any other object. He is there as if she didn't exist, as if she were a piece of furniture, and yet she is speaking to him. She literally gives names to what partakes in the symbol, since it can be named immediately, but which was, up to that moment for this subject, just reality, pure and simple. So Dick is not interested in toys, although Melanie Klein knows that he had an interest in doors and handles, and also that he had an interest in train. But from moment zero, immediately she starts saying, here's the little train, this is Dick, the station is Mommy, Dick goes into Mommy. So she starts giving names to this. And clearly, if this is creating an effect on Dick, well, he was participating in the symbolic world to some extent at least. So he's not completely excluded from the symbolic order. And Lacan says that the strongest identification that Dick shows is that he identifies with the void, with the dark, right? He, we would say, identifies with the empty container. He makes here, we will not discuss this because he doesn't give us any further explanation of what he means. But Lacan says here, this gap is precisely what is human in the structure peculiar to the subject. So what he's hinting at is that we all feel the gap. We all feel the void, the lack, that we are incomplete, that something is lacking in us. But in Dick, we see like naked this structure of identifying with the void and not being able to get out of this void and invest in objects, attach to objects, name them, play with them, manipulate them. Certainly, he has some sense of vocables, words, but these words he hasn't given a beyahun. Beyahun, remember, the basic affirmation. He hasn't assumed them. So Lacan is saying he's partaking of the symbolic order to some extent, but he's not affirming his eros, right? His basic libido is not able to invest this object. And so he's not being able to develop as a subject, but he also can see through Melanie Klein's text that some potentials and some elements are already there. The same way that he was saying that he partakes in the symbolic order, he's not excluded from that. And he also says he has a potentiality for empathy because he's so perfectly at ease in relation to reality, like everything is indifferent. With this neutral attitude, once he saw pencil shavings on Melanie Klein's blouse, and Dick says, "Oh, poor Mrs. Klein," right? So he shows this empathy when he sees like this basic fact of something fragmented, these little fragments of the pencil on Melanie Klein's blouse. Now, Lacan says, and I'm sorry that I'm making this too long, but I think there are many details that we need to get in order to not to get lost with Lacan's next step. One way in which Lacan summarizes what's happening to Dick is he makes no call, right? So he's talking about how when the nurse leaves him at Melanie Klein's office, he doesn't show any distress. He doesn't show any anxiety about separation from this nurse that is one of the most important persons in Dick's life, in the same way that he has this cold relationship with his mother. So he makes no call, right? And the call, right? Calling the other is like one of the most basic linguistic functions. Of course, Lacan is interested in language. And Lacan says it's not even on the same level as making a statement. It's basic. It's like a precondition. Lacan says you have only to observe a pet. So like think about your dog, your cat, to see that a being deprived of language is quite capable of making calls on you. You know, your dog wants to go out or your cat wants food, and they can call you. They can get your attention, right? So this is like the precursor of making a request, invoking the other, calls to draw your attention to something which in some sense or other it lacks. One of the most basic functions of language is one of the most basic utterances that we observe in children are imperatives. Water, more, right? They don't even need to say, give me more. They say more or food or up or daddy. These are requests. These are imperatives. So when we see this in children, these are children making a call, invoking the other, right? So language not as some kind of computation that we do with our brain, not as some kind of calculus, not even the syntactical structure, the basic communicative function of language of invoking the other. This child, Dick, does not voice any call to the nurse, to Melanie Klein, to his mother. The system whereby the subject comes to locate himself in language is interrupted at the level of speech because this call is not there. This child is not outside language, but he doesn't speak. So Lacan is making a difference between the symbolic order and the act of speaking. In a way, he's saying Dick is in the symbolic order, but he's not yet speaking. He's not invoking the other. He's not making a call. There is a subject here who does not reply. What does Melanie Klein do with little Dick? Lacan says when she talks about the trains and mommy's womb and Dick going inside mommy, Lacan says she's not making an interpretation. She starts off from ideas she already had. So what she knew about psychoanalysis, what she knew about Dick, ideas about what happens at this stage. I won't beat about the bush, just tell him. Dick, little train, big train, daddy train. She's symbolizing objects and relationships. She plastered on the symbolization of the Oedipal myth to give it its real name. The station is mommy. Dick is going into mommy. Very quickly, the child makes progress. That's a fact. I'm paraphrasing Lacan. It's almost literally what he says in the seminar. He acknowledges that Melanie Klein's intervention is very effective. And what he wants to do is conceptualize this. It's something more basic than an interpretation, because when you interpret, it's because The signifiers are already there. There's a chain of signifiers. There's free association. There's discourse, and you operate with this discourse, right? You find metaphors. You find displacements. You find a scene that comes up repeatedly. But here, this is something very basic. She's not interpreting. She's giving name to these very basic object relations. And so Dick starts making progress and verbalizes a first spoken call, right? He wants his nurse to pick him up. He misses his nurse. This is his first communication in the strict technical sense of the term. The child symbolizes the reality around him, starting with this nucleus, this little palpitating cell of symbolism which Melanie Klein gave him. So she gives him the seed, and from there, the child feels, of course, contained and able to regulate his anxiety, and this game starts to expand, and the symbolization of objects starts to expand. And now Lacan says something very weird. If you stop here, I want you to be surprised, if you are surprised like me with the way Lacan says this. He says, the unconscious is the discourse of the other. What he means here is that rather than thinking with Melanie Klein that all these meanings, all these significations, it was all inside little Dick's head, that it was everything inside his mind, he says, with this basic act that Melanie Klein does when she names the objects, she's actually constituting this subject, constituting his unconscious. For Lacan, we are a result, an effect of language. We are constituted and permeated by language. And so what is Melanie Klein doing here? It is Melanie Klein's discourse which brutally grafts the primary symbolizations of the Oedipal situation on to the initial ego-related inertia of the child. Lacan is saying the child does not develop, the child is stuck because of his ego, because of the defense against the world and against everything that is threatening. That's the ego. But the subject is constituted by Melanie Klein's intervention. There's not a previous unconscious waiting, as Melanie Klein thinks, waiting for her interpretation. Rather, first comes the discourse of the other, the Oedipal myth. She's giving shape to this myth, and this is affecting, constituting, shaping the subject. If the ego is what is actually being the obstacle for this subject to develop, why does she speak? Lacan asks about the development of the ego, and he says she is confusing the ego and the subject. So what is constituted in these interactions in session is the subject, not the ego. For Lacan, development takes place insofar as the subject integrates himself into the symbolic system, acts. So if you read this carefully, again, Lacan is not talking about ego development. He's talking about the development of the subject. Development takes place insofar as the subject integrates himself into the symbolic system, acts within it, asserts himself in it. Through the use of genuine speech, the subject who has all the elements of language at his disposition and who has the possibility of making several imaginary moves that allow him to structure his world, might not be in the real. What Lacan is saying is Dick was in the real at the beginning, and thanks to Melanie Klein's intervention, something happens. And what happens is that the discourse of the other, in this case embodied in Melanie Klein, impacts on Dick, integrates him into the symbolic system, and allows him to become active in this system, to become a subject of speech. And the imaginary moves, the introjections, the fantasy, the projections, the aggression, are all a byproduct of this symbolic change. He becomes human, he's humanized. And Lacan says, Melanie Klein herself is saying in the text that it was the ego that was halting development. Okay. So with that, we are done with Lacan's comment on Melanie Klein's case. What I have here in this slide is Freud's model of the mind, he called it, of the psychic apparatus in the interpretation of dreams. In this book, in chapter 7, he postulates a model of the mind. Freud, throughout his work, and especially in the Traumdeutung, in the interpretation of dreams, uses lots of metaphors. Metaphors related to electric energy, financial metaphors like we use investing today, political metaphors like censorship, I mean, right? Or repression. These are all political metaphors. But Lacan says he also uses a metaphor that comes from optics, from physics. And the way Freud explains this is if you look through a microscope, right? Let's say, imagine that I have a microscope, that I have like this tube with a lens here, another lens there, and I put something here, right? But where do I see this real object that is below? Let's say I have some tissue here that I'm observing with my microscope, and the real tissue is down here. But if the microscope is here and I'm looking through it, I see it in the middle of this tube, right? I have this cylinder with two lenses, and the image appears to me closer than the real object. So this is a virtual image, right? It's a virtual object. I'm seeing the object, and I know this has to do with reality, but I am not seeing the object where it actually is. I'm seeing it closer. Same thing if you're using a telescope. So Freud uses this metaphor to talk about memories in the mind. The aim of this metaphor is that when he's talking about these memories, we are not thinking too literally of material objects in our brain, not a specific region of the brain, a specific tissue, or specific neurons, but doesn't matter what they are physically located. The important thing for Freud is that there is an input into the psychological system through perception, that you can see that on the left. Then that creates memories, creates marks in our mind. And then here you have the unconscious, the preconscious, the motor response that is conscious. So these are virtual images, virtual locations for these memories. So it doesn't matter if you don't get it exactly, but this is what I want you to get, is the basic idea that Freud is using this optical metaphor to explain how in the mind we locate things in different places. Like this memory is close to this one, but is far apart from that other one. This is closer to the consciousness, far away from consciousness. These are virtual locations. They don't need to match physical locations. Psychical locality will correspond to a point inside the apparatus at which an image comes into being. We have images, and we can place them in some place in our network or our web of memories, but that's not a physical location. It's a virtual locality. In the microscope and telescope, as we know, these occur at ideal points, regions in which no tangible component of the apparatus is situated. So the system goes from perception in the left, then it leaves marks inside our memory, and to the right we approach the conscious response, and that's expressed through movement, through some action. Okay, so now we get to the first optical schema that Lacan is offering us in Seminar 1. So for now, before we get to understand this as a metaphor, let's first try to focus on how this mechanism works. What's the logic behind this experiment? So the idea is, I don't know if you see my mouse, this is a vase, and on this vase, there is nothing actually. So these flowers up here are not in reality. On this little box, on this table, there is only a vase, right? Behind, hidden from the view of the observer, there are these flowers hanging upside down. And on the right, there is this spherical mirror, a concave mirror, right? And if a person is watching from this position, on the left, he sees the flowers on the vase as if the flowers were really on the vase. For this, you cannot do this with a plane mirror. A flat mirror will not work for this. But if the mirror is circular, spherical, and also the eye is at the right location, right? So the vase, the flowers, and the eyes need all to be placed at the exact location for this illusion to work. If everything's placed at the right location, then you look at this and you see a vase with flowers on it. What's going on? Well, the flowers that are under the table are reflected on the mirror. What you see is the reflection of the flowers in this mirror, and it creates the illusion that the flowers are here, right? Why does it need to be circular? Because you see these lines crossing here. There are these laws of optics that only if all the gray lights cross at this point, and the eye is also in this middle position, then the illusion works. A couple of terms. We could say for now that the vase is real and the flowers that are under the table are also real. We are actually, if we are this eye, then we are able to see this real object. So let's call it a real image. We have the image of the vase, but it's a real object in the world. It's a real image, right? Now, the flowers also appear in our world. So from our point of view, we cannot distinguish the real image of the vase, which is also reality, a real object, and the real image of the flowers that are just an image. Why do we call them real? Because they appear in our real world. This is different from a virtual image. When you're looking at me on this screen now, this is not a real image. It's a virtual image because I'm on a flat surface and I am not part of your 3D real world. So I'm clearly a virtual image. If you look at a photograph, if you look at yourself in the mirror, those are virtual images. They are not occupying space in the real world. But the flowers, if you do this trick right, they appear. It's like, what is it in Star Wars 1, the very first one, which is actually the only one I watched. When you have Princess Leia, yes, the holograms. You see that their little robot projects the image of the princess and the hologram appears in the real world. So it's a real image. And when you're watching Instagram Reels, they don't appear in the real world. They are virtual images. They appear on this flat surface and you know that you're just seeing images. But when you see Princess Leia or when you see these flowers on the pot, or when you see a rainbow, exactly. This is the other example Lacan uses. You see a rainbow, these are real images. They appear in the world. So Lacan is saying to make sense of all of this, but also to make sense of our practice in psychoanalysis, we need to distinguish the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. Without these three systems to guide ourselves by, it would be impossible to understand anything of the Freudian technique and experience. The relation of the vase to the flowers that it contains can serve us as a metaphor, right? So he's not saying that the mind is literally like this experiment, but yes, that this experiment provides a very interesting metaphor to think about the three registers. The rainbow. You see a rainbow at a certain distance, as if stitched to the landscape, stitched onto the landscape. It is a subjective phenomenon, but thanks to a camera, you record it entirely objectively. So what is it? We no longer have a clear idea, which is the subjective, which is the objective, right? When you are a child, what do you think? If I walk and go, I get to the rainbow. Right? This is the illusion. But actually, it's impossible, right? The more you approach the rainbow, they either goes away or actually fades out at a certain point. Right? It's an illusion. But why can't then you photograph it? Because the camera is built also taking into account the eye, the same rules of optics that apply to the eye. So the camera is not a neutral instrument. So Lacan says, isn't the camera a subjective apparatus, entirely constructed with the help of an X and a Y, right? We have coordinates. The lens of the camera has to work in the right way. An X and a Y which take up residence in the domain which the subject inhabits, that is to say, that of language. So because we have language, and we talk about space, and we talk about three dimensions, and we can also analyze between depth and width and height, and so we can build a camera that actually is reproducing our experience. So the fact that the camera takes the picture of the rainbow doesn't mean that the rainbow is objectively real. It's still an image. For there to be an optics for each given point in real space, there must be one point and one corresponding point only in another space, which is the imaginary space. So Lacan here is talking about two things at the same time. One is literally the loss of optics, right? So if you look at something in the mirror, why does it make sense? Because for each point of light in the mirror, we would say in a screen, each pixel, right? Each little point, there corresponds an object in reality. And the same order between the elements of the object in reality is reproduced in the mirror. So there has to be this correspondence one-to-one between the real and the imaginary, the real and the image. That's why he says the imaginary space and the real space fuse. Nonetheless, they have to be conceived of as different. Here he's saying, yes, the imaginary, for example, our image of our body, how we see ourselves, is in relation to our real body. But if you are an analyst, you will need to work to distinguish both levels. When a subject is free associating, you need to do this operation of distinguishing the real from the imaginary, what belongs to the fantasy world of this client or this analysand. A spherical mirror, right, like the mirror we were discussing, produces a real image, the flowers. To each point of a light ray emanating from any point of an object placed at a certain distance, there corresponds in the same plane, through the convergence of the rays reflected on the surface of the sphere, another luminous point, which yields a real image of the object. So it's very complicated, but what he's saying is that for each point in these flowers, the light that emanates is reflected in the mirror, and each point in the flowers has a correspondence with a point in the mirror. And this is why you can see the flowers placed on the vase. Lacan says, what if we put the real flowers on top and the vase down? We can do the same experiment, right? It will work. We just are inverting these two objects. The flowers go down and the vase goes up. This is something typical that Lacan's like to do these kind of operations when he inverts something, or like he did with the signifier and the signified, right? But why? Because he wants the vase to represent the body and the flowers to represent our instinctual life, our drives, our libido. Our libido is a bunch of things. It's a bouquet, right? It's these diverse, fragmented oral drives, anal drives, genital drives, impulses, these partial objects that Dick needs to unify. And Lacan is saying, I can explain how the unified subject emerges is through what he calls the mirror stage. We're talking again about mirrors. When the child looks at his image or her image in the mirror and says, that's me. And this anticipation, because he says he's still not a unity from like the motor point of view, but this anticipation of I am one, I am this beautiful kid. Sometimes this is also, there has to be a symbolic structure supporting this. So there's mommy and daddy saying, look at yourself in the mirror. Oh, the baby, how beautiful the baby. So the baby looks at herself in the mirror and rejoices at recognizing herself in this unified image. So this imaginary act of unification, this is for Lacan. This that belongs to narcissism. This is how this unity is achieved. The unity of the body, an imaginary unity, right? So this is why he's identifying the container. Remember, Dick, the container. He wants to place the container below this device, because the container is what is just anticipated as an image on the mirror, whereas the real thing are the drives, the libido, the energy, this fragmented aspect, this hodgepodge of drives that constitutes the baby.